She stood there, eyes fixed on the rows of desks in front of her, hands still gripping the notebook. The school bell rang, signaling the end of class, but she didn't rush like the other teachers. She knew that today, like every day, there would be another round of sharp words, another dose of humiliation from her boss. "You're not good enough. You lack experience." These phrases pierced her like knives, and yet no one could see the pain behind her forced smiles. Her heart felt heavy. No one noticed that behind the facade of calm and professionalism, she was barely holding on. How many more days could she keep pretending that everything was fine? Each morning, she put on her best face, but every night she asked herself the same question. Am I really cut out for this? But as her eyes scanned the classroom, they landed on a student in the back. His gaze wasn't filled with pity, nor was it the cold judgment she had grown so accustomed to. No, his eyes held something far more powerful, understanding, and something else. A quiet, unwavering question. "Are you okay, miss?" A single glance from him and something in her shifted, though she didn't know it yet. That moment, seemingly small, would change everything. Call to action. The story begins with silence, with the unnoticed pain of someone who has been struggling alone. But can a small act of kindness truly change the course of things? Stay tuned and watch as this unexpected twist unfolds. If you've ever felt like no one sees your struggle, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Lena walked into the classroom early every morning, long before the first bell rang. She was used to the stillness, the silence of an empty room. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was her only company as she prepared for another day. She made a quick sweep of the desks, checked the chalkboard for any stray marks from the day before, and placed the lesson plan neatly on her desk. It was a small, humble classroom, nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. But it was hers, and that small ownership meant everything to her. She had always wanted to be a teacher. From the time she was a little girl, she had imagined standing in front of a classroom, helping young minds grow and flourish. She remembered the hours spent playing teacher with her younger brother, pretending to grade papers and explain math problems, her tiny hands holding a stack of imaginary assignments. But dreams, she soon realized, didn't always align with reality. At 28, Lena found herself teaching at a public high school in a modest, working-class neighborhood. The students, a mix of different backgrounds, came from families struggling with everything from financial hardship to emotional trauma. But Lena saw potential in every one of them. She knew she could make a difference, no matter how small. She would stay late after school to tutor students, bring in extra supplies from home, and create lesson plans designed to engage each student no matter their skill level. Her commitment was unmatched, but so was the weight of the burdens she carried. Her supervisor, Mr. Harrington, never failed to remind her of the things she lacked: experience, authority, discipline. "You're too soft on them, Lena," he would say. "You can't be their friend, you're their teacher." The words would always sting, even though she had heard them 1,000 times. And yet, every time he passed by her classroom, she made sure to smile and greet him with respect. She wanted to prove herself, wanted him to see that she was capable, that she deserved to be there just as much as anyone else. But it was never enough. Not for him. Not for the system that seemed to have already written her off. Her colleagues, too, had grown distant. They were busy, caught up in their own struggles, or perhaps in their own small victories. Lena had never been the type to socialize much. She preferred to stay focused on her students and her work. But she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. They all knew what was happening, the way Mr. Harrington was slowly undermining her, yet no one stepped forward to speak up. One of the few people who had always supported her, even if quietly, was Mrs. Thompson, the teacher in the classroom next door. Mrs. Thompson was in her mid-50s, a veteran educator who had seen it all. She'd often offer Lena a smile and a word of encouragement when things got tough. "You're doing great, don't let him get to you," she'd say, though even Mrs. Thompson had to admit that the environment at the school was tough on teachers like Lena. But the reality was clear. It was hard to stand out when you were always overshadowed by others. especially someone like Mr. Harrington who held the power. Then there was Ethan. He was one of Lena's most promising students, a quiet kid who sat in the back row, his eyes often hidden behind the pages of a book. Ethan had a reputation for being a loner, but Lena could see beyond that. She could see the intelligence in his eyes, the spark of creativity that no one else seemed to notice. He was sharp, witty, and kind, always willing to lend a hand to others when they needed it. But there was something deeper beneath his surface, a quiet pain that he carried, one that Lena could relate to in ways no one else could. Lena had noticed Ethan's struggles from the start. His grades were inconsistent, his behavior erratic, but she sensed it was more than just teenage rebellion. She had talked to him a few times after class, and he had slowly opened up, revealing snippets of his life, his troubled home, the constant pressure to live up to his father's expectations, the feeling of never quite belonging anywhere. In many ways, Ethan reminded Lena of herself when she was younger. But things were far from perfect. Lena had always been a dreamer, an idealist. She thought that if she gave enough of herself to her students, they would see her dedication, they would understand that she truly cared. But the reality of the school system, of bureaucracy and red tape, was beginning to weigh on her. She was running out of steam. It was a Thursday morning when everything shifted, although Lena didn't see it coming. The students had filed in, as usual, taking their seats, some chatting with their friends, others half asleep. Lena had just finished writing the day's lesson on the board when Mr. Harrington walked in, his face grim. "Miss Carter, I need to speak with you," he said, his tone sharp. Lena's stomach tightened. She had a feeling this wouldn't be a simple conversation. She followed him into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind them. Mr. Harrington wasted no time. "I've been getting complaints from some of the parents about your teaching style," he said, his voice cold. "They think you're not challenging the students enough. You're being too lenient. You need to tighten up." Lena felt her heart sink. She had been doing everything she could to engage her students, to make them feel valued. But now, it seemed like that wasn't enough. It never was. "I'm doing my best," she said, her voice wavering. "I'm trying to reach them, to help them understand." "You're trying too hard to be liked," he retorted, his gaze piercing. "A teacher's job isn't to be liked. It's to teach. And frankly, you're not doing it well enough." Lena felt the sting of his words, a familiar, gnawing ache creeping up in her chest. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. "You need to improve," he added, his final words landing like a heavy weight. "Or we'll have to reconsider your position here." And just like that, everything Lena had worked so hard for felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She stood there, in the hallway, trying to compose herself, but inside she was falling apart. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the next class, Lena took a deep breath and returned to her classroom. She pasted on a smile, the same one she always wore, and began the lesson as though nothing had happened. But inside, the weight of Mr. Harrington's words pressed down on her like a boulder, threatening to crush her. But unbeknownst to her, someone had noticed, someone who had been quietly watching her for weeks. The days following Mr. Harrington's warning dragged on in a haze. Lena tried to focus on her lessons, but it was as though a cloud had settled over her mind. Every time she entered the classroom, she felt like an imposter, her every move scrutinized, her every word questioned. The students, at least, had no idea. They still came to her for help, still trusted her to guide them. But it was getting harder for Lena to believe in herself, harder to convince herself that she was doing enough. By Friday afternoon, Lena was feeling the pressure like never before. Her lesson plans, once a source of pride, now seemed like an uphill battle. Every attempt to engage her students felt like a failed experiment. She had tried to explain algebra concepts in new ways, using real-world examples, but the blank stares in front of her told a different story. Sitting in her small office after school, Lena leaned back in her chair, eyes staring at the clock. She had 1 hour before the meeting with Mr. Harrington, and she dreaded it. He had asked to see her again, and this time, Lena could sense that it wouldn't be about improvement or suggestions. It would be about the future of her career. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Mrs. Thompson. "You're doing great. Don't let him get to you. We see the difference you're making. Keep going." Lena read the message twice, letting the warmth of her colleague's words wash over her. Mrs. Thompson had been one of the few people who seemed to believe in her. But even with the encouragement, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that her best wasn't enough. As the minutes passed, Lena stood up and grabbed her bag, slipping her phone into her pocket. She could already hear Mr. Harrington's voice in her mind, sharp and impatient. The door to his office loomed ahead, and as she stepped inside, the familiar coldness of the room enveloped her. "Miss Carter," Mr. Harrington said, not looking up from the stack of papers in front of him. "Have a seat." She did as instructed, though she couldn't help but feel the weight of every second ticking by. The tension in the room was thick, like something waiting to break. "I've been reviewing your student evaluations," he continued, flipping through the papers, "and it's clear that things aren't improving. The students aren't responding to your teaching style. And frankly, I've had enough of these constant complaints from the parents." Lena's stomach turned. She knew what was coming. She had feared this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, it hit harder than she had imagined. "I'm doing my best," Lena said, her voice shaking slightly. "I know I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to reach them. I care about my students, Mr. Harrington. Isn't that what matters?" Mr. Harrington's eyes finally met hers. There was no warmth in them, only a cold, calculating gaze. "You think this is about caring? This is about results. You're not producing results, Lena. And in this school, that's all that matters." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, to tell him about the hours she had spent after school tutoring students who were struggling, the countless times she had stayed late to plan lessons, the personal sacrifices she had made just to be there for her students. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she sat there, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. How had it come to this? Was her passion for teaching not enough? Was it possible that in the end, she wasn't cut out for this after all? "Your performance will be reviewed again in 3 months, Mr. Harrington continued. "If things don't change, we'll have to let you go. Simple as that." Lena nodded, her throat tight. "Understood." She left the office without saying another word, her feet heavy as she walked down the hallway. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she could keep fighting. When she reached her car in the parking lot, Lena paused for a moment, staring at her reflection in the side mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She had always told herself that no matter how hard things got, she would never give up. But now, the weight of the world seemed to press down on her shoulders, and she didn't know if she could carry it any longer. The next morning, Lena arrived at school early again, but this time, the halls felt emptier. There was no sense of hope in the air, only the dread of another long day. She went through the motions of teaching, but it was harder than ever to focus. Her students noticed it too. Some whispered amongst themselves, some stared at her with concern. In the middle of her 4th period, when Lena was explaining a particularly challenging math problem, she saw something that made her pause. Ethan, the quiet student in the back of the room, was standing. Not standing to ask a question, but standing as if he were about to say something. He cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the entire class. His eyes met Lena's, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to disappear. "Miss Carter," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think you're doing just fine." Lena froze. The class fell silent, and all eyes were on Ethan. He was normally reserved, rarely speaking up in class. But today he had something to say. "I don't think you're the problem," Ethan continued, his words steady despite the nervousness in his posture. "It's the system. It's the people who don't understand you, who don't get how hard you're working. You care about us, and we know that." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, Lena felt something stir in her heart, a flicker of hope, a reminder that maybe she wasn't invisible after all. She didn't know how to respond. She just stood there, her hands trembling, her heart racing. Ethan sat back down, his gaze still locked on her. The rest of the class remained quiet, the atmosphere charged with an unspoken understanding. Lena didn't speak again for a moment, too overwhelmed by what had just happened. She had been so focused on her own doubts and fears that she had forgotten about the people she was truly there for, her students. And in that instant, something changed. For the first time in a long while, Lena remembered why she started teaching in the first place. It wasn't for the approval of Mr. Harrington or anyone else. It was for them, her students. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe the problem wasn't her. After Ethan's unexpected words in class, the next few days felt like a quiet turning point for Lena. The weight that had been suffocating her began to lift just a little. His simple act of standing up and speaking the truth had reminded her of something important, that there were still people who believed in her, people who understood the struggle. But even with this newfound sense of support, Lena couldn't escape the reality that was closing in around her. Mr. Harrington's warnings hung like a sword over her head, and every glance from her colleagues made her feel more like an outsider than ever. The walls were closing in, not just from the administration, but from the system that seemed hell-bent on stifling any glimmer of individuality or passion. The following Monday, Lena entered the school with a renewed sense of purpose. She spent her morning lesson planning with more energy, her thoughts clearer than they had been in weeks. She couldn't let Mr. Harrington or anyone else define her. If this was her fight, she would fight for the students who depended on her, and she would fight for herself. But the system had a way of smothering that light. In the middle of the morning, Lena received an unexpected visit from the school counselor, Mrs. Wright, who had been nothing but kind to her over the years. Mrs. Wright was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s, always with a warm smile, despite the hard edge her job had given her. She was one of the few people who had been there for Lena through the highs and lows, offering advice and guidance when Lena needed it most. "I need to talk to you about something, Lena," Mrs. Wright said. Her voice hushed as they met in the teacher's lounge. "I don't want to alarm you, but I think you should know." Lena raised an eyebrow, confused. "What is it?" "It's about the upcoming teacher evaluations," Mrs. Wright said. "I've been hearing that your name's been brought up in the next round of reviews. Mr. Harrington is pushing hard to have your contract reviewed early. They're not just looking at your performance, they're looking for reasons to let you go." Lena felt her chest tighten. It was one thing to hear Mr. Harrington's harsh words, but this felt like a betrayal. She had always known he didn't like her, but to know that the wheels were already in motion behind the scenes felt like a stab in the back. "How do you know this?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "People talk," Mrs. Wright replied, her face softening with sympathy. "I just wanted you to be aware. I know you've been doing everything you can, but, well, the system's not going to make it easy for you." Lena nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of this new information. The feeling of injustice that had been slowly simmering inside her was now beginning to boil over. "Thank you for telling me," Lena said, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what to do, though. It feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Mrs. Wright gave her a stern but understanding look. "You're not alone in this, Lena. But you need to be smart. Don't give them more ammunition. Stay professional, stay strong, but make sure you're covering your bases." Lena knew Mrs. Wright was right, but the idea of trying to cover her tracks, of constantly worrying about how she was being perceived, was exhausting. Why couldn't she just teach? Why did it have to be a fight for basic respect and dignity? The conversation lingered in her mind as she returned to her classroom, and for the first time in a long while, Lena felt a deep growing sense of anger. It wasn't just about the system anymore. It was about a broken system that didn't care about the people it was supposed to serve. It was about the fact that she had given so much of herself, only to be treated like she was disposable. And worst of all, it was about the idea that someone as hardworking and passionate as her could be cast aside so easily. The day seemed to drag on, each hour longer than the last. Lena did her best to stay focused, to be there for her students, but the weight of what Mrs. Wright had told her sat heavily in her chest. Ethan's words still echoed in her mind, but they felt distant now. The support of one student didn't feel like enough to take on the entire system. As the day ended, Lena found herself sitting alone in her classroom, staring at the pile of papers that needed grading. Her hands hovered over the assignments, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Harrington and the looming threat of losing her job. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ethan. "Hey, Miss Carter, I know things are tough, but don't give up. You're making a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it. Don't forget why you're here." Lena smiled despite herself. His words, though simple, carried the kind of truth that she needed right now. She stared at the screen for a long moment, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. That hope was fleeting, though, as Lena heard footsteps approaching her classroom. She looked up just as Mr. Harrington stepped into the doorway, his face stern as ever. "Miss Carter, I need a word," he said, his tone as cold as it had been during their last meeting. Lena's stomach dropped. She had been hoping to avoid him, to have just a little peace, but now here he was, standing in the doorway, ready to remind her once again that she wasn't good enough. She stood up, straightening her posture, though inside, her heart was racing. "What is it, Mr. Harrington?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a deliberate click. "I've been reviewing your student evaluations," he said, his eyes cold as he glanced at the papers in his hand. "And frankly, they're not good enough. Your performance is still lacking, and I'm beginning to think you're not the right fit for this position." Lena could feel the walls closing in. She had expected this, she knew it was coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. "I'm doing my best," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I care about my students. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to make a difference." Mr. Harrington's gaze hardened. "It's not enough. It never will be. Maybe it's time for you to consider your future here." His words hit her like a slap across the face. Her whole body went cold, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. How had it come to this? How had she ended up here, fighting for something that should have been so much simpler? Lena took a deep breath, pushing the tears back. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice steady now. "But I don't deserve to be treated like this." For the briefest moment, Mr. Harrington's eyes flickered, and Lena saw something, perhaps a flicker of doubt, perhaps something else. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Think about what I said," he said, turning to leave. "Your future here depends on it." And with that, he was gone, leaving Lena standing alone in the empty classroom. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. It felt like she was at the edge of something huge was about to happen, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. The days following her confrontation with Mr. Harrington felt like they were moving in slow motion. Lena's mind kept replaying his words over and over again, each repetition carrying a weight that sank deeper into her chest. "Maybe it's time for you to consider your future here." Those words had cut through her, deep into the heart of everything she had worked for. It wasn't just the threat of losing her job that haunted her, it was the complete dismissal of everything she had poured into this school, into her students. Mr. Harrington's indifference, the coldness with which he wielded his power, made it clear that for him, Lena was nothing more than a cog in a machine, expendable and easily replaced. The next morning, she woke up late, something that had never happened before. She rushed to get ready, pulling on the first clothes she could find, her mind still clouded with exhaustion. It had been a long week, filled with sleepless nights spent working through lesson plans, grading papers, and trying to stay afloat in a sea of mounting pressure. But today, she didn't even have the energy to pretend that things were fine. Lena barely spoke a word during breakfast, the silence in her apartment as heavy as the thoughts swirling in her head. She felt numb, drained, and disconnected from everything that had once mattered to her. She loved teaching. She loved the moments when she saw the spark of understanding in her students' eyes when they learned something new and felt proud of themselves. But now, everything felt like it was slipping away, as if the very thing she had dedicated herself to was slowly turning against her. She arrived at school that morning, her feet dragging as she walked into the building. Her usual routine, checking the lesson plan, greeting the students, felt mechanical now. Every step, Every word she said seemed like it was happening in a fog. She felt like a ghost in her own life, disconnected from the passion that had once burned inside her. The first period came and went in a blur, the students barely noticing her disconnection. She didn't blame them. They were just kids, struggling with their own battles. But as the day went on, her mood grew darker, heavier. It wasn't just the feeling of failure that weighed on her. It was the realization that her fight wasn't about teaching anymore. It was about surviving. By the time lunch rolled around, Lena felt like she had reached her breaking point. She walked into the teacher's lounge, hoping for a moment of quiet, a small escape from the chaos that seemed to be closing in on her. But as soon as she entered, she was met with the familiar, cold stares of her colleagues. They had heard the rumors, the whispers about her performance, the meetings with Mr. Harrington. As Lena made her way to the corner, a few of them exchanged glances, but no one spoke to her. It was as though she had become invisible, a ghost in a place she had once considered home. The loneliness pressed in on her, and for the first time, Lena felt the full force of isolation. She sat down at an empty table, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her lunch. But she couldn't bring herself to eat. The weight of everything, Mr. Harrington, the evaluations, the feeling of being constantly judged and criticized had become too much. It was all she could do to keep her composure. Suddenly, the door to the lounge opened, and Mrs. Thompson stepped inside. Her face was weary, but there was a softness in her expression that made Lena feel a small flicker of warmth. "Lena," she said gently, sitting down across from her. "How are you holding up?" Lena forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just tired." Mrs. Thompson studied her for a moment, her gaze full of understanding. "I can see that it's hard right now, but I need you to remember something. You're doing more than just teaching lessons. You're changing lives." Lena swallowed hard, feeling the tears begin to well up in her eyes. She had tried so hard to keep everything together, to put on a brave face for her students, for her colleagues, but the pressure was too much. It was all unraveling. "I don't think I can do this anymore," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "I feel like I'm failing them, failing myself. And no matter how hard I try, nothing ever seems to be enough." Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Lena, I've been in this game a long time, longer than most people here, and I can tell you this, there's always going to be someone trying to bring you down. Always. But you can't let them win. You can't let the system crush the fire that's in you." Lena shook her head, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "But what if I'm just not good enough? What if everything I'm doing isn't enough to make a difference?" Mrs. Thompson's gaze softened, and for a moment there was no teacher, no mentor, just two women sharing a moment of vulnerability. "Lena, you're more than enough. And I know you're tired, but don't you dare let them take that from you. You have to fight. Not for them. Not for Mr. Harrington. But for those kids. For you. Because the difference you're making is real. Don't let them erase that." Lena blinked, the tears threatening to fall now, but she held them back. Mrs. Thompson was right. The weight of the system was crushing, but she couldn't give in. She couldn't let it define her. She had to find her strength again. As the lunch break ended, Lena wiped her eyes, standing up with a newfound resolve. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that." Mrs. Thompson smiled, giving her a brief, encouraging hug before she left. "You've got this, Lena. One day at a time." That afternoon, as the bell rang and students began filing out of the classroom, Lena stood at the front, watching them with new eyes. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that she had forgotten what had brought her here in the first place. The kids. She knew that she couldn't let Mr. Harrington, the school system, or anyone else take that from her. She had a job to do, a mission, and if she had to go down fighting, so be it. But she wouldn't go down without a fight. She would stand for them. As the last of the students filed out, Lena turned off the lights in the classroom, her heart still heavy, but with a flicker of determination that hadn't been there before. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The following week felt different. Despite the constant undercurrent of tension, Lena noticed something in herself that had been missing for a while, a quiet strength, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. It was as though, in the darkest moment, she had found a spark that could not be extinguished. She started each morning with a sense of purpose, something more than just getting through the day. It wasn't about pleasing Mr. Harrington anymore. It wasn't even about survival. It was about doing what she was meant to do, teaching. She was reminded in small moments when a student asked for help, when someone grasped a difficult concept, that she was making a difference. And that was enough. She couldn't let the broken system define her worth. But the world outside her classroom was still a constant battle. Even as Lena gave her all to the students, she could feel the weight of Mr. Harrington's looming threat. The fear of the evaluation still hung over her head, making it impossible to fully relax. She had no idea when the final decision would be made, but she knew it was coming soon. The fear of losing her job, of losing her place at the school, pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake off. One Tuesday afternoon, the tipping point arrived. Lena was in the middle of a particularly challenging lesson on geometry when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Mrs. Thompson. The message was brief, but it hit like a thunderclap. "Lena, you need to come to my classroom after school. I have something important to tell you." Lena's heart skipped a beat. There was an urgency to Mrs. Thompson's message that made her stomach churn with unease. She couldn't concentrate on the lesson for the rest of the class, her mind spinning with questions. What was so important? What did Mrs. Thompson need to tell her? When the bell rang and her students rushed out, Lena packed up her things quickly, her mind racing. She made her way to Mrs. Thompson's classroom, her footsteps echoing through the hallway. It felt like the weight of the world was closing in around her with every step. Mrs. Thompson's classroom was quiet when Lena walked in. The older teacher was sitting at her desk, looking pensive, but warm as usual. She gestured for Lena to sit down across from her. "I'm glad you came," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "I didn't want to tell you this over text." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She took a seat, trying to steady her breath. "What is it? What's going on?" Mrs. Thompson glanced around the room, as though making sure no one else could hear. "I've been talking to some of the other teachers, and I heard something that you need to know." Lena felt a sudden wave of dread wash over her. She had been preparing for the worst, but nothing could prepare her for what Mrs. Thompson was about to say. "It's about Mr. Harrington," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice low. "I've been hearing whispers about what's been going on behind the scenes. It's not just about you, Lena. It's about a lot of teachers here. Mr. Harrington has been pushing for cuts. He wants to get rid of people who don't fit his ideal of what a teacher should be. And you're not the only one on his radar." Lena's stomach churned. "So, it's not just me?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "No," Mrs. Thompson said, shaking her head. "There are others too. But what's worse is that I think Mr. Harrington has been manipulating things to make it look like you're underperforming. He's been coaching parents to write negative feedback about you. He's been stacking the deck against you." Lena felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Her mind raced as she processed the revelation. Mr. Harrington wasn't just a strict administrator, he was an active player in a system that was intentionally designed to tear her down. "I don't know how you've managed to keep going under all this pressure," Mrs. Thompson continued, her tone filled with sympathy. "But Lena, you need to know that you've been set up. This is bigger than you. It's a scheme to push out teachers like you who care too much, who want to make a real difference." Lena sat there, stunned, the weight of Mrs. Thompson's words sinking in. All along, she had thought it was her fault, that she wasn't good enough. But now the truth was laid bare. Mr. Harrington had been orchestrating this whole thing, using her as a pawn in a larger game to rid the school of anyone who didn't conform to his vision. A mixture of anger and relief surged through her. Anger at the manipulation, at the injustice of it all. But also relief, because now she understood. It wasn't her. It was the system. And that knowledge gave her the strength to keep going. "I won't let him win," Lena said, her voice trembling with emotion. I'm not going to let him ruin everything I've worked for. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression serious. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Lena, you're not alone in this. There are teachers who see what's happening, and we're ready to help. But you need to be smart about this. If you want to fight back, we need a plan. Lena felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't alone. She had allies. And more importantly, she had the truth on her side. It wasn't just about fighting for her job, it was about fighting for all the teachers like her who were being silenced, erased by a broken system. I don't know where to start, Lena said, the uncertainty still lingering. Mrs. Thompson smiled softly. The first step is to get the truth out. There are people in this school who've been quiet, but they're watching. If you stand up now, others will stand with you. You've already got students like Ethan who see you for what you are. That matters. People who care make a difference, Lena. And people will listen if you don't back down. Lena felt her resolve harden. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let the system crush her spirit any longer. She had to fight for herself, for her students, for the teachers who had been silenced. As she left Mrs. Thompson's classroom, Lena felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She still had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of control. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready to face it head-on. The days following Lena's conversation with Mrs. Thompson felt like a whirlwind. What she had once seen as a solitary fight, just her against the system, had suddenly become something much bigger. The truth about Mr. Harrington's manipulations, the way he had been slowly pushing her and others out of the school, was now something Lena couldn't ignore. She wasn't alone, but just as quickly as she felt empowered, the shadow of retaliation loomed over her. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The first sign came early on Thursday morning, when Lena found an email in her inbox from the school board. The subject line was short and to the point: immediate review of your employment. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she clicked open a message. It was exactly what she had feared, a formal notice informing her that her employment was now under review due to persistent concerns raised by administration and stakeholders. The email continued with a list of vague complaints, things that she knew had been planted by Mr. Harrington, things she had worked tirelessly to overcome. Yet none of her successes, none of her dedication were mentioned. The email was a cold, impersonal document designed to push her out. Her hand trembled as she read through it, feeling the weight of the system closing in on her. Mr. Harrington's fingerprints were all over this. He had made sure she would be branded as a failure, no matter how hard she tried. She quickly closed the email, staring at the blank screen. Her heart pounded in her chest, the anger and frustration that had been simmering inside her for weeks finally spilling out. She had always been the type to rise above the negativity, to keep her head down and keep working, but now that had become impossible. They were coming for her, and they weren't stopping. The anger that burned inside her was matched only by a deep sense of betrayal. This wasn't just about her job, it was about everything she stood for. Her values, her integrity, her dedication to her students. The system had seen her as a threat from the beginning, and now it was ready to crush her. Lena knew that this was it. This wasn't just a small battle. This was a fight for her future. And if she was going to survive, she would need to make some tough decisions. That afternoon, during her planning period, Lena sat in the teacher's lounge, trying to collect her thoughts. She had just finished going over the formal review process when she was joined by a familiar face. Mrs. Thompson, always perceptive, saw the tension in Lena's posture the moment she walked in. "You've seen the email, haven't you?" Mrs. Thompson asked softly, taking a seat beside Lena. Lena nodded, her eyes downcast. "I don't know what to do. This feels like it's over." "It's not over," Mrs. Thompson said firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "This is the beginning, not the end." Lena looked up, her eyes red from lack of sleep and the emotional toll of the last few days. "How can you say that? They're coming for me, Mrs. Thompson. They've already made up their minds. The board's review is just a formality." I can't fight this. Mrs. Thompson leaned in closer, her voice low. You're not going to fight this alone. You've got the truth on your side. And I know people, teachers who have been through the same thing, people who've watched Mr. Harrington manipulate the system for years. It's not just you. You need to make sure everyone knows what he's been doing. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She had been so focused on the battle for her job that she hadn't considered the bigger picture. Mr. Harrington wasn't just an obstacle to her success. He was a threat to the integrity of the entire school. But how do we expose him? Lena asked, the words tentative but determined. How do we stop him before he does this to someone else? Mrs. Thompson smiled faintly. We start by getting the truth out. We gather the evidence, the stories, the proof. There are other teachers, parents, even students who have witnessed Mr. Harrington's tactics. We need to make sure their voices are heard. For the first time in days, Lena felt a sense of clarity. The path ahead wasn't easy, but it was possible. She had to expose the system that had been so carefully designed to tear people down, and she had to do it now. She couldn't keep letting it happen, not to her and not to anyone else. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and secret meetings. Lena and Mrs. Thompson began gathering testimonies from other teachers, parents who had seen the unfair treatment, and even students who had witnessed Mr. Harrington's dismissive attitude toward those he deemed unfit. They compiled a dossier of everything that had gone wrong, everything that had been covered up, and everything that could prove Mr. Harrington's misconduct. Lena didn't sleep much during this time. She spent her evenings working with Mrs. Thompson, reviewing documents and writing up testimonies. She was doing what she had always done, working tirelessly to make a difference, but this time it felt different. This time, she was no longer just fighting for a job. She was fighting for the truth. On Friday afternoon, just before the school day ended, Lena received a phone call from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. Lena, the voice on the other end, said, and it took her a moment to recognize it. It was Ethan. Miss Carter, he said, his voice hesitant but clear. I overheard something today. I don't know if it's important, but I thought you should know. Lena sat up straighter, her mind alert. What did you hear, Ethan? I was in the office waiting for my mom, and I overheard Mr. Harrington talking to someone. He was saying that he's already made up his mind about you, that you're out. He said something about your performance being unacceptable and that no one would stand up for you. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. Did he say anything else? Ethan hesitated. He mentioned that the review process was just a formality and that no one would question his decision. Lena's hand clenched into a fist, her pulse quickening. This was it, the proof she needed. Mr. Harrington had been planning her removal from the start. It wasn't just about her performance, it was about his power, his control over the school. And now, thanks to Ethan, she had a witness. Thank you, Ethan, Lena said, her voice tight with emotion. You've helped more than you know. I just wanted to help, Ethan said. I believe in you, Miss Carter. You're the best teacher I've had. Lena felt tears welling in her eyes, but she pushed them back. She wasn't going to cry. Not now. She hung up the phone and took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had what she needed. With this new evidence, it was time to take the next step. She wasn't just going to let Mr. Harrington win. She was going to expose him for what he was and show the school system for what it had become. The next morning, Lena called Mrs. Thompson and the other teachers they had been in contact with. She had a meeting scheduled with the school board, and this time, it wasn't just a review of her performance. It was a reckoning. The week after Lena's meeting with Mrs. Thompson was a blur. She had submitted the evidence she had gathered, testimonies, emails, and Ethan's overheard conversation about Mr. Harrington's manipulations to the school board. It felt like the final step in a battle that had been brewing for months. But now, as she waited for their response, every second felt like an eternity. She couldn't shake the feeling of nervous anticipation. What if the school board dismissed everything? What if they turned a blind eye, just like Mr. Harrington had? The fear that had haunted her for so long crept back into her thoughts, and Lena couldn't stop herself from worrying. She knew she had done the right thing. She had exposed the truth. But what if that wasn't enough? It wasn't until the following Monday that Lena finally received word from the school board. She was in the middle of a lesson, watching her students slowly work through a series of math problems when she saw Mrs. Thompson walk into the classroom, a look of determination on her face. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She knew something was happening. Mrs. Thompson's presence could only mean one thing. "Lena, the board wants to meet with you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "Now." Lena's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived. She felt a wave of emotion rush through her, fear, hope, and disbelief. For so long, she had felt like she was fighting an uphill battle, but now, with the truth finally out, it was time for it to be heard. She nodded, standing up from her desk and following Mrs. Thompson down the hallway. As they walked, Lena couldn't help but notice the looks they received from her colleagues. Some of them filled with sympathy, some with curiosity. She didn't know what to make of it. She had always been a teacher who kept to herself, who focused on her students and the lessons she had to teach. But now, it felt like everyone was watching her. And for the first time, she didn't mind. They reached the conference room where the school board members were waiting for her. Mr. Harrington was there, sitting at the head of the table, his expression cold and unreadable. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. The room was filled with a tense silence as Lena took her seat at the table. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The air seemed thick with the anticipation of what would happen next. She glanced around the room at the faces of the board members, some of whom she had never met before, and then at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her an encouraging smile from across the table. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Lena Carter," he began, his voice as cold as ever, "I'm sure you understand why we've called this meeting. Your performance has been under review for some time now. We've heard your side of the story, and we've reviewed the evidence that's been presented." Lena felt her heart race. She knew this was the moment that would determine everything. She had to speak her truth, and she had to do it with conviction. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "the evidence speaks for itself. You've made it your mission to undermine me, to push me out of this school, and I have the proof to back that up. I didn't come here today to plead my case. I came here to tell you the truth, to tell you that I won't stand by while you manipulate the system for your own gain." The words felt liberating as they left her lips. For the first time, Lena wasn't worried about what would happen next. She was done with fear. She was done with silence. One of the board members, a woman with glasses and short dark hair, turned to Mr. Harrington. "Is this true? Are you really accusing Miss Carter of undermining the system and coaching parents to write negative reviews about her?" Mr. Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't respond immediately. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence as the board members waited for him to speak. Finally, he cleared his throat. "These are just allegations," he said, his voice tight. "Miss Carter has consistently failed to meet the performance standards required by this school. She lacks the discipline and authority needed to be an effective teacher." Lena felt the anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. "That's not the truth," Lena said, her voice unwavering. "The truth is that I've given everything I have to my students. I've worked long hours, I've stayed after school to help them, and I've done everything I could to make sure they succeed. But you've never cared about that, have you? You care about control. You care about power. And anyone who threatens that, anyone who doesn't fit your ideal, is out." The board members were quiet for a moment, absorbing Lena's words. Then, one by one, they began to speak. "I've seen Miss Carter with the students," said another board member, a man with graying hair. "She's always been dedicated. The kids respect her. And from what I'm hearing, she's not the only one who's been treated unfairly by Mr. Harrington." Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her colleagues had come forward. She had not been fighting this battle alone, after all. The truth was starting to spread. You've been "Using your position to push out teachers you deem unfit," said the woman with glasses, turning back to Mr. Harrington. "And now, the truth is coming to light." Lena glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. She wasn't alone. She had allies, and together they were going to make sure this system didn't destroy any more lives. Mr. Harrington, the board member, continued, "It seems we have a lot to review. I think we need to take a deeper look at your actions as well as the culture you've been fostering here." Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in months, the weight she had been carrying seemed to lift. She had done it. She had fought back, and the truth had been heard. "I will step aside from my position while we review the allegations," Mr. Harrington said stiffly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time that day he had looked uncomfortable. Lena nodded, feeling a sense of vindication. It wasn't over yet, but this was a huge step forward. She had faced the system, stood her ground, and now it was beginning to crumble. The weeks that followed the school board meeting were a blur of change. Mr. Harrington was placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending the outcome of a formal investigation into his actions. The school's administration, shaken by the revelations and the support Lena had gathered, began to make promises of reform. It was no longer just a fight for her career. It was a fight for the future of the school, for every teacher and student who had ever been caught in the crossfire of an unjust system. Lena wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere between the ongoing meetings, the support from her colleagues, and the encouragement of her students, she started to realize something. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for them, the students, her colleagues, the ones who had never been given a voice. And in doing so, she was creating something more than just a classroom. She was creating a culture of change. The days seemed to stretch on, yet they also felt full of purpose. Every day was another step toward building something better, not just for herself, but for everyone in the school. Lena had been thrust into the role of a leader, though she hadn't asked for it. Her journey had started with a small act of courage, speaking up when it felt like no one else would. But that single act had snowballed into a movement. One afternoon, as the school year began to wind down, Lena found herself walking through the halls, feeling the weight of everything she'd gone through. It had been a long and exhausting battle, and though she wasn't entirely sure what the future held, she had a feeling that things would never be the same again. Lena had been invited to speak at the school's end-of-year assembly, a gesture she had never anticipated. In the past, she had always been the quiet teacher in the back of the room, never one for public attention. But now, as the date of the assembly drew closer, she knew that this was a moment she couldn't shy away from. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was representing every teacher who had ever felt powerless, every student who had been overlooked, and every voice that had been silenced by the system. The day of the assembly arrived, and Lena stood backstage, her palms sweating. The gymnasium was packed, filled with students, teachers, and staff members. She could hear the murmurs of conversation from the crowd, the buzz of anticipation. The podium in front of her loomed large, and for a moment it felt as if the weight of the entire school rested on her shoulders. "Are you ready?" Mrs. Thompson asked, standing beside her with a supportive smile. Lena nodded, though she could feel her nerves still churning inside her. She had been through so much already, fighting against the system, exposing the injustices, but this felt different. This was a chance to make her mark, not just as a teacher, but as someone who had changed the course of things. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked out onto the stage. The noise of the crowd hushed as she stepped up to the podium, and for a moment she simply stood there, looking out over the sea of faces. There were students she had taught, teachers she had worked beside, and administrators who had been forced to face the consequences of their actions. And they were all watching her now. Lena cleared her throat, her voice surprisingly steady as she began to speak. "I wasn't always the type of person to speak up," she began, her words filling the room. "I used to think that if I just did my job, kept my head down, followed the rules, things would work out. But the truth is, sometimes doing the right thing means going against the system. It means standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when you feel like you're fighting a losing battle. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. I know that many of you are tired. Tired of fighting, tired of feeling like your voices don't matter. But I'm here to tell you that they do. Every voice matters. Every story matters. And if you see something wrong, you have the power to change it. Lena's heart raced, but she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone in that room who had ever felt silenced or dismissed. She was speaking for the students who deserved to have their voices heard, for the teachers who had given everything only to be undermined by a broken system. And as she spoke, she realized that this was what it was all about. This was her legacy. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. It's easy to feel like we're just small pieces in a big machine, but I've learned something over these past months. We are more than that. We are the heart of this school. We are the ones who make it what it is. And when we stand together, when we refuse to accept injustice, when we support one another, there's nothing we can't do. There was a moment of silence after her words, and then the room erupted into applause. The sound was overwhelming, and Lena felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't done this for the applause, but in that moment, it felt like a validation of everything she had fought for. It was the recognition she had been searching for, not from Mr. Harrington or the school board, but from the people who mattered most, her students, her colleagues, the community. As the applause died down, Lena looked out over the crowd once more. She saw faces, students who had struggled, teachers who had supported her, and even a few administrators who had started to change their attitudes. There were still challenges ahead, but the fight had shifted. It was no longer about her alone. It was about something much bigger, a school, a community, a system of education that could be better, fairer, and more, just for everyone. That evening after the assembly, Lena sat in her classroom, reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight of the past year felt like a distant memory, fading into the background as she looked forward to the future. She had fought against a broken system, exposed the truth, and stood up for what she believed in. But more than that, she had inspired others to do the same. She had found her voice, and with it, she had made a difference. And as she glanced at her classroom, the place where it had all begun, Lena knew that her work was far from over. But now, she wasn't just surviving. She was creating something new, something better. And that was her legacy. The school year ended with a sense of relief that felt both earned and bittersweet. Lena had taken on a fight much bigger than herself, and while the battles were far from over, she could see the first signs of a world shifting, slowly but surely. The aftermath of Mr. Harrington's suspension and the school board's pledge to investigate the systemic problems had reverberated through every hallway, every classroom, and every corner of the community. But what Lena hadn't expected was how deeply her actions had touched others, igniting a spark that extended far beyond her own classroom. It wasn't just the students who noticed the changes. It was the parents, the community members, and even teachers from neighboring schools. Word spread quickly about the teacher who had stood up to the system, and as Lena's story made its way through social media, local news outlets, and community gatherings, she began to realize the scope of her impact. One afternoon, a week after the school year ended, Lena sat in her apartment, flipping through the local newspaper. Her eyes lingered on an article that had appeared on the front page, a feature about her journey, her fight against the system, and the ripple effect it had created in the local education community. The headline was simple but powerful: One Teacher's Fight for Justice, How Lena Carter Exposed Corruption and Inspired a Movement. She read the article, her heart swelling as it described not just her actions, but the response they had triggered. Teachers from other schools had reached out, sharing their own stories of facing similar challenges. Parents had called, expressing their gratitude for her bravery in standing up for what was right. And most of all, students who had once felt overlooked or undervalued began to send messages telling her how her courage had inspired them to believe in their own power to create change. The phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from Mrs. Thompson. Lena, I wanted to let you know that the board has finally agreed to revise their teacher evaluation process. They're taking the complaints about the system seriously, and for once, they're listening. Your fight didn't just change your school, it's going to change the whole district. Lena smiled, reading the message again. She hadn't expected this. She had fought for herself, for her students, and for her colleagues. But now, it was clear that the effect of that fight was spreading beyond her wildest dreams. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and it wasn't just in her school. It was going to reverberate throughout the entire district. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Lena stood up, wiping her eyes as she walked to the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a familiar face, Ethan. "Hey, Miss Carter," he said, his shy smile still as genuine as it had been when he had first stood up for her in class. "I wanted to thank you." Lena blinked in surprise, stepping aside to let him in. "Ethan, what are you doing here? What's going on?" "I just wanted to thank you," he said again, more earnestly this time. "I don't know if you know, but I'm moving to a new school next year. My mom got a new job, so we're moving out of state. But I wanted to tell you something before I go." Lena felt a pang of sadness. She had seen Ethan struggle over the past year, but he had grown so much, both in the classroom and outside of it. He had found his voice, and in doing so, he had helped her find hers. "Ethan, I'm really going to miss you," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far this year. I'm proud of you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but his eyes were steady. "It's not just about me, Miss Carter. You helped me see that it's okay to speak up, to stand up for myself. I didn't know how important that was until you showed me. And now I know that if something's wrong, I can do something about it." Lena's heart swelled. She had always known that teaching was more than just delivering lessons. It was about helping students find their voices, find their confidence, and find their courage. And in Ethan, she had seen that growth firsthand. "I'm going to keep standing up for what's right," Ethan continued. "And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. You've changed everything. You've made us all believe that we can make a difference." Lena wiped her eyes, trying to hold back tears. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. And I know that you're going to do amazing things. Never forget that you have the power to change the world." As they said their goodbyes, Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment wash over her. This wasn't just about the battles she had fought in her school, it was about the lives she had touched. The ripple effect was real, and it wasn't just the students who had been inspired, it was the parents, the community, and the educators who had seen the power of one person standing up and speaking the truth. Later that week, Lena was invited to speak at a local community forum about her experiences. She was hesitant at first. Public speaking wasn't something she was accustomed to, but after some encouragement from Mrs. Thompson and a few of her colleagues, she agreed. The event was held at a local library, and the room was packed. Parents, teachers, and even local politicians filled the seats. It was a diverse group of people, all there to hear Lena speak about her journey, her fight, and the changes that had come from it. When Lena stepped up to the microphone, she felt a sense of responsibility she hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the community, about ensuring that the changes she had fought for weren't just temporary, but long-lasting. "I've learned a lot over the past year," Lena began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've learned that the system isn't always built to support those who need it most. I've learned that sometimes doing the right thing means going against the people who are supposed to support you. But most of all, I've learned that we have to speak up. We have to demand better for ourselves and for each other. Because when we do, we can change the world." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, they began to clap. Slowly at first, but then with more conviction. Lena felt the warmth of their applause, but it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the message being heard. The change she had started was real, and it was spreading. As the event concluded, Lena found herself surrounded by parents, teachers, and even a few local officials, all thanking her for what she had done. But one moment stood out above the rest. A mother with tears in her eyes approached Lena and said, "You gave my daughter the courage to stand up for herself." She used to be so quiet, so afraid of speaking out. But because of you, she knows that her voice matters. Lena couldn't hold back her tears anymore. This was what it had been about all along. Not the fight for her job, not the battle against Mr. Harrington, but the lives she had touched. The legacy she had created wasn't just in the changes at the school. It was in the people she had empowered to stand up, to find their voice, and to make a difference in their own lives and communities. As she left the event that evening, Lena felt a sense of peace. She had started this journey unsure of what would happen next. But now, looking back, she could see that every step had been worth it. The ripple effect was real, and the change she had sparked wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. The world was responding, and it was just the beginning. The air was warm as Lena walked out of the school building for the last time that summer. The sky stretched out above her, clear and full of promise. It had been a long and turbulent year, full of obstacles, but also filled with moments of triumph. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. She had been through so much, from the injustice she had faced in her own classroom, to the betrayal by the system, to finding the strength to stand up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or silenced. It had been a journey of transformation, one that had not only changed the way she saw the world, but also how she saw herself. Lena paused at the edge of the school parking lot, her hand resting on the gate as she glanced back at the building. It was no longer just a school. It was a place of renewal, a place where she had fought for what was right, a place where she had found her voice, and a place where, despite everything, change had begun to take root. She had spent countless hours in these halls trying to inspire her students, but in the end, it was they who had inspired her. They had shown her the power of standing up, of using your voice for something greater than yourself. And in doing so, they had helped her find the courage to keep fighting when it felt like everything was falling apart. Lena felt a quiet smile tug at her lips as she thought about them. The students who had rallied behind her, who had seen her not just as a teacher, but as someone who cared, someone who would never give up on them. They had stood with her, just as she had stood with them. The sound of footsteps behind her pulled Lena out of her thoughts. She turned around and saw Mrs. Thompson approaching, a familiar smile on her face. Heading out, Mrs. Thompson asked, falling into step beside Lena as they both walked toward the parking lot. "Yeah," Lena replied, her voice soft but full of emotion. "It's strange. It doesn't feel real. I can't believe it's over." Mrs. Thompson laughed quietly. "It's never really over, you know. This work, it's ongoing, but I think you've made a huge difference here. You've created something real. You've given people the courage to speak up." Lena stopped walking, turning to face her colleague, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. You were the one who believed in me from the start. You were the one who showed me that there's more to teaching than just the lessons we give in the classroom. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Mrs. Thompson placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "You were always capable of this, Lena. I just helped you see it." For a moment, they stood there in silence, both taking in the gravity of the journey they had been through. Lena had come a long way from the quiet, unsure teacher who had walked into that school months ago. She had fought, she had struggled, but she had emerged stronger. And more than that, she had found something she never expected, a sense of purpose, a legacy. As they stood there, a small group of students began to gather in the distance, walking toward the exit. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she recognized Ethan at the front, his familiar shy smile lighting up his face as he waved at her. "Miss Carter," he called, his voice filled with excitement. "We're all here. We wanted to thank you." Lena's eyes misted over as she watched Ethan and the others approach. There were a few faces she hadn't seen in a while, students who had graduated, some who had struggled but persevered, and others who had been quietly affected by the changes she had fought for. And now, here they were, standing together, their presence a testament to the difference she had made in their lives. Lena's voice caught in her throat as she met their gaze. "You didn't have to do this. Thank you. Thank you for everything." Ethan stepped forward, holding out a small box. "We wanted to give you something," he said, his voice a little shaky with emotion. "A thank you for being there when no one else was." Lena took the box, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside, she found a small hand-painted plaque that read, "For Miss Carter, who taught us to never stop fighting." She gasped, the words hitting her harder than she had expected. I don't know what to say," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you can imagine." Ethan smiled and shrugged. "You helped us see that we're not powerless. We can make a difference. And we wouldn't have learned that without you." The other students nodded in agreement, and one by one, they took turns hugging her. Lena stood there, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and gratitude from the students she had worked so hard to support. They had taught her as much as she had taught them, and in this moment, she understood more deeply than ever that this work, this fight for justice, was never truly about one person. It was about the collective. It was about all of them, standing together, making their voices heard. As the students slowly began to leave, Lena felt a wave of peace settle over her. This was her legacy, not the battles she had fought or the struggles she had faced, but the lives she had touched, the way she had inspired others to speak up, to stand tall, and to believe in their ability to change the world. Mrs. Thompson stood beside her, watching the students walk away. "I think you've earned your rest," she said with a knowing smile. Lena chuckled softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I think you're right, but I'm not done yet. There's still so much work to do." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Of course there is. But remember, change is slow, but it's real. And you've made a real difference here." As the sun set behind the school, casting a warm golden glow over everything, Lena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past year lift off her shoulders. She had come so far, had endured so much, but now, as she looked out over the school grounds, she saw something beautiful, something she had never expected. Hope. And it wasn't just her hope anymore. It was everyone's. Lena took one last look at the school before she got into her car, her heart full of gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs. As she drove away, the sound of her students' laughter echoed in her mind, a reminder that the change she had started would live on in them, and that, in the end, was all she needed to know.